Hey everyone, welcome to the Ultimate MySQL Developer Bootcamp. I know it's a bit of a mouthful of a title. My name's Colt, I'll be your instructor for this course. So in my experience, the first couple minutes of any course, sometimes the first day of a college lecture, is all devoted to introducing the instructor, talking about the syllabus, and talking about TAs and exercises and turning in assignments, and you don't actually get to cover much of the content that you care about. But this is a MySQL course. I want to talk about MySQL as soon as possible. So here's the promise I'm going to make you. I'm going to talk about who I am and my background, if you care about that. I'm going to talk about what the course covers, what it doesn't cover. I'll show you the projects and the assignments, all of that fun stuff in just the next 4 minutes. And then by the next 5 minutes, by the 5th minute of this course, we'll be typing SQL code. We won't have to install anything, we won't have to get set up. We have this nice workaround in the browser where you'll be able to actually run code immediately. Okay, so that's my promise to you. With that said, I'll shut up. I'll start talking about myself and who I am in the next video, and then we'll move on with the syllabus and so on. But remember, end of this section, we'll be typing code. All right, let's get started. Hey there, welcome to the next video. So in this video, all I'd really like to do is spend a couple seconds introducing myself, as well as introducing Blue. This is our course TA. You'll see her pop up a couple times in the course. Hopefully you don't have a problem with cats. Anyways, so my background really is that I've been teaching people to program in person for the last 5 or so years. I've been teaching web development boot camps in the San Francisco Bay Area, pretty much nonstop. So if you're not familiar with boot camps, web development boot camps that is, the way that they typically work is that they're 3 to 6 month long programs where students basically commit their lives for that duration to learning to code and nothing else. It's a very, very intense program. We take students who have 0 programming experience all the way up to the point where they get web developer jobs. So really rewarding work. I fell in love with teaching 5 or so years ago. And recently I decided to try my hand at taking my in-classroom approach and trying to bring it online. So this is my second course. And this course, as you know, is on MySQL. It's kind of the next logical step to teach online. So I used to teach this in person as well. I'm now trying to take my curriculum and bring it to the classroom online. All right, so that's enough about myself. If you do have any questions, if you're curious or you're actually interested in in-person boot camps, you have questions, absolutely reach out to me, send me a message or post a question on the discussion boards. All right, see you in the next video. So what I'd like to do in this video is take a quick tour or walkthrough of the syllabus, talk about the curriculum, what the course covers and what it doesn't cover. And at the same time, it's a good place to talk about prerequisites, if there's any experience you need for this course. And the short answer is no. But there's a longer answer. There are a couple things that might be helpful. So the way I'd like to do this, rather than just talking to you sitting at my desk, is to actually use the magic of editing, very high-tech, fancy skills here, and hop into the syllabus now and just go over some of the details with you. All right, I'll see you there. Okay, so I'm looking at the syllabus here. There's currently 300 or so different lectures across 17 different sections. And I won't waste your time going over every single section. I just want to point out some of the big trends and kind of where we're going based off of where we are right now. So the next section is really focused on setting the stage for what MySQL is, how it compares to other databases, what makes something a database, what's SQL compared to MySQL, and then we shift focus to installing. So by the end of that section, you'll have your own copy installed. And then from there, we really dive into code. We see how to create databases, how to put data in there, and then we focus a lot of time on how to get data out. How do we write complex queries? And along the way, there are dozens and dozens of exercises, including section 6, which consists entirely of challenges. It's the CRUD exercise challenge, where we spend a lot of time working with one data set in detail. Then we keep moving on, basically working our way up towards more complex queries, asking more complex questions of our data. So all of this contains things like aggregate functions, learning about string functions, learning how to work with dates and date times, how to sort our results, and then also working with logical operators. And if none of that means anything to you, don't worry. But if it does, you're looking for it, you'll find it in this syllabus. And then we move on to our next chunk of content, which has to do with interrelated data. With more complex data structures, how do we represent them with MySQL or with SQL? So we start talking about joins. If you've heard of joins before, sections 12 and 13 focus on joins. And then in section 14, we start working with our Instagram database clone. So what we'll do here is actually set out to come up with a clone of an Instagram-like database. Obviously, it won't be as complex as Instagram, but we work with things like photos and users and comments and likes and hashtags and followers and friends, all that fun stuff. So we'll set up our database here, we'll design it, and then section 15 is all challenges using that Instagram data. So it sort of serves as a final exam to the course, although it's not a test. There's solutions immediately after, but it sums up everything we've done until this point. You'll have a bunch of data, thousands and thousands of rows of data that I'm going to provide you. You'll put it in your database, and then you'll write code to answer a bunch of real-world questions that someone or some company might have about the data. But that's not the end of the course. We move on at the end into kind of a broader section where we start talking about MySQL plus other languages. So we see how to interact with Node in MySQL. And then finally, the course ends when we build a simple web application using MySQL and Node.js together. So that's a rough overview of all that we cover. One thing you might be wondering about are the prerequisites. And I did say earlier that there are no prerequisites. You don't have to have any experience aside from being able to work with a computer, being able to work with the internet, download things. But I should note that towards the end, well, at the very end, when we start talking about Node.js and building a web app, it definitely will help if you're familiar with things like JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. This isn't a course on those topics, so I don't spend hours and hours going over them like I could. However, I do spend a little bit of time introducing them in a couple minutes doing a crash course. But that's not the focus of this course, so that's the only note I would add. If you're here just for MySQL and that's what you're concerned about, there are no prerequisites. But if you really want to be able to understand Node.js at the end and the web app that we build, it will help if you have a little bit of experience with HTML and CSS and JavaScript. Other than that, though, no prerequisites. All right, I mentioned I wanted to get us writing some code as soon as possible, so that's what we're going to do in this video. Obviously, it's super early on in the course, so don't get your hopes up for doing anything crazy impressive. It's going to be pretty basic, but the idea is that I just want to introduce you to writing some SQL, show you what it's like. So the first thing you'll need to do is click on this link if you want to open the slides. I've included them with this lecture, or I've included the link itself as a resource with this lecture. So however you would like to get there, go to this link, which takes us to this page right here. This is the Try SQL Editor. And I'm going to make my screen a little bit bigger just so that you can see it. Here we go. And I'll start by just deleting what's already in there. So you might be wondering, what is this place? That's a good question. It's an interactive browser-based SQL environment. And what that really means is that think of it as your own personal SQL sandbox in the browser, where you can go try some things out and play around. It's purely for educational purposes. So this is not what you would be doing if you were actually working with a real production database. But what it lets you do is type some SQL queries and run them by clicking this Run SQL button, and you'll get a result. And that's fundamentally the process of working with SQL. You type something, and then you run it, and then you get something back. Oh, and before we go any further, I should point out that we're talking about SQL here, not MySQL yet. And if you're confused about that distinction, totally normal question to have, wait until the next section when I go into detail about the differences. But for now, I'd like you to try running some code. So here's the first line of SQL that we can try running. Select star from customers. So you can either type this or copy it from the slides or from the included code file after this lecture. So I'll just copy it from the slides here. And then back in the editor, I'll paste it in and click run. So the first thing you'll notice is that we get a bunch of data back. So I'm not going to go into the details of the syntax and what all of this means for every command we run. It's really more about just giving you an experience of running commands. The rest of the course talks about the details and the syntax. But what this does is it gives us all of the data about customers in this database. So you can see we've got 91 customers, and every customer here has a name. So these are stores or restaurants. There's the contact at the restaurant or at the business, the address, the city, the postal code, and the country. Okay, so that's all I'll say about that. Select star from customers. That gives us all of our customers' data that are in the database right now. So here's another thing we could try. It's very similar. Select star from orders. So we'll just copy that. And back here in the editor, I'll paste it in and click run SQL, run SQL. Same thing happens, but this time we get all of our data printed out for our orders. So you might be wondering, where is this data coming from in the first place? Very good question. It's pre-programmed in here. So every time you open this in your browser, you have this preloaded data set that you can work with. And just by taking a quick look at our order data, you can see we have things like an order ID, a customer ID, an employee ID, an order date, and a shipper ID. But there's really not much descriptive information here. And that's actually why I chose this table. I wanted to make the point that a lot of the data you'll be working with on its own, or like a snapshot like this, isn't very meaningful. What we actually want to do is start combining it with other tables. So we're not going to do that now, but that's what we're building up towards the end of the course, is how do I combine customers with orders and products and shippers to get some meaningful answers out of my data. So here's another thing we can do, very similar to what we've done already, but there's a little bit extra. So select star from products, order by price, descending, DESC. And if I paste that in here and click run, what I get now are all of the products in my database. So they have a product ID, a name, a supplier ID, category ID, a unit, and then a price. And they're currently sorted by most expensive down to the cheapest all the way at the end. So I won't force you to listen to me trying to pronounce some of these, but these are our products and they're currently sorted by price. So just a simple modification to the query yields radically different results. And if we just get rid of that order by price, we get the same data back, but now it's ordered by product ID rather than the price. Okay, and stepping up in complexity a little bit here, here's another query, this one significantly longer. And this one actually involves two different entities. So we saw customers, we saw orders separately. If you try copying this and pasting it in, and you click run, what we actually get here is a list of records for a customer, and then the number of orders a given customer has placed. So remember, this data is stored in two separate places. We had the customer's data that had nothing to do with orders, and then we had the orders data, and all that it contained was customer ID, and then we've combined them with this query. So do not focus on the syntax, don't panic about that. Of course, we'll get there. We'll talk a lot more about how to structure queries. Most of this course is about structuring complex queries. In fact, here's a quick preview of some of the things we'll be doing. So here's an example of a slightly more complicated query. This time we're working with photos and images. We're working with users and likes and putting them all together to get some information out. And here's another one, a little bit crazier, where we're working with ratings or reviews and TV shows and reviewers. So think of like a Netflix or iTunes where you could rent or watch a TV show and then rate it from 1 to 10 or 0 to 5 or whatever the rating scale is. Here we're working with that data to figure out who our power users are, who are the most active users who are reviewing the most things. So we'll be building up to these sort of queries. And by the end of the course, you should be able to make sense of this and do a lot more, by the way. Okay, so that was a taste of SQL. Hopefully it didn't taste too bad. So in the next section, we'll dive into the nitty-gritty of what SQL is and how it compares to MySQL. We'll get everything installed, and then finally, we'll have our first set of exercises. All right, so I have some good news, which is that in the next video, we're gonna start typing code. We're gonna start with SQL. The bad news is that we still have to make it through this video. Hopefully it's not too painful. Essentially what I want to talk about is different types of content in the course and how the course really works. It might be a little different than other courses you've taken online, depending on how they were structured. Basically, I break the content into a couple different categories. The first are things like this video, where it's a video of me talking, usually with Blue, and you know what, you don't have to watch them. They kind of just serve to introduce content. It's a way for me to kind of interact with you, to say hello, and to set the stage for what comes next. And if you're someone who has no patience for that sort of thing, absolutely skip it. So then after that, we've got the actual content of the course, the lectures. So there are a ton of videos where it's mostly a screencast, and I'm explaining concepts. I usually make a bunch of diagrams, slides. I try and make things somewhat visually interesting. I'm not a great graphic designer, but I try and keep things interesting to look at. And then I also, type code. And there's a lot to watch there, ideally. So it's a combination of slides with me talking over it, as well as diagrams and animations, and then most of the time typing code in our text editors and running SQL code. So those are the lecture videos. But then we've also got, and this is probably the most important part, more so even than the lectures, which are the exercises. So one of the things that I think makes my courses stand out a bit, some of the feedback I've gotten, has to do with exercises and activities. And I think they're really, really central to making a good course. So I kind of throw them everywhere in the course. And then within those exercises, we've got a couple different categories of challenges. The first are what I would call rapid fire, basically pause the video, I'll ask you a question, very short quiz type questions. And then there are the second type of exercises, which usually come at the end of a section, the last video typically, and it's an entire video dedicated to exercises. Usually there's like 5 to 10 challenges in that video. And then following that, there's always a solution video where I go over the solutions, I tell you the answer, and then also show you myself coding them. And as always, the solution code is available if you don't care to see me explain it. If you just want the code, you can get that at any time. And the final type of challenge is more comprehensive. It's essentially, there are a couple of sections that are entirely devoted to exercises. So they might have 7 or 10 different videos, but they're all about one set of problems. So there's not many of these in the course, they take a while, but there are a couple of these challenge sections. So just to reiterate, we've got quick rapid fire questions, we've got more general kind of summation quizzes and exercises at the end of a section, and then we've got entire challenge sections. And of course, after every lecture, I include the code, all of the commands that I type. They're in a file that always comes after the lecture, and it always starts with the word code in all capital letters. So the last thing I'd like to add is a piece of advice, I guess, which is that I highly recommend you do the challenges and do these exercises. Obviously, I have no control over that. You can just skip through everything and just take the pieces of the course you need. But if you're trying to get the full experience, kind of the way that I designed it, I would do all the exercises, do the challenges. Even if that means, going at a slower pace. It definitely means you'll go at a slower pace. But you'll learn much better, and hopefully you'll have a better experience. And with that said, the other component that's really important are the discussion forums. We have a full-time TA in the course, as well as myself, who are here to help you at any point. So absolutely lean on that. Ask any questions you can come up with. We're here to help. All right, on to the code in the next section. Hey there, welcome to the next section. So this section is really important. It's where we actually start talking about code. It's where we install everything. And by the end, you'll be running your own SQL commands. So some big things we're doing. To start off, we're just going to talk about what makes something a database. What makes something a database compared to, just a programming language. What's the difference? And then we talk about the difference between SQL, and MySQL, a really common question, and something that's basically fundamental to all databases or all relational databases, at least. And then from there, we're going to move into installing stuff. Really important step for this course. You'll install MySQL, get it up and running. And by the end of the section, for some of the challenges and exercises, you'll be running your first bit of MySQL code. So nothing crazy. We're not working with any complex data yet. We will be, but not yet. We're starting off nice and easy, just some simple commands, but still it's something. So by the end of the section, we'll be doing that. All right, let's get going. All right, so we're going to start off by taking a bit of a step back and talking about two very high-level general questions that are pretty central to everything this course is about. And they are, first off, what is a database? Seems like it's a pretty straightforward question, but there is a little bit of terminology we need to discuss. And then secondly, why do they matter? So let's start off with the first one. What is a database? What actually makes something a database? And there are a couple of definitions that we could go with here. I kind of synthesized some of them into my own definition that has two parts. And the first part is that it's a collection of data, which seems pretty straightforward. There are all sorts of collections of data around us in the real world. Things like when you go to your doctor's office and there's a filing cabinet full of medical records, or even just a to-do list or a list of things to buy at the grocery store qualifies as a collection of data. Or going back a little bit in time, if you remember what Rolodexes were, a Rolodex full of different people's contact information, that qualifies as a database under this definition. Speaking of archaic technology like a Rolodex, another example of a database is a phone book. So I say this mainly jokingly, but I actually have some siblings who don't know what a phone book is, or they've never seen one or used one before. It's a gigantic book, basically, that lets you look up people's phone numbers based off of their name. So it's usually organized by last name alphabetically for people. So you would flip through the book until you find someone's last name, and then you would try and match their first name, and then you find their phone number. So let's take a quick example here. This is a fictional phone book. Think of it as just a little section of a phone book that has tens of thousands of entries. And these are fictional characters, alphabetically organized by their last name. So Archie Andrews comes before Betty Cooper, who comes before Ned Flanders, and so on. And then we have corresponding phone numbers. So imagine you have a gigantic phone book with this information in it, and I asked you to do something like find Ned Flanders' phone number. Well, it's actually pretty straightforward as long as you're comfortable using the alphabet in alphabetical order. You flip through the book until you find F, FL, and so on until you find Ned Flanders, and then you find his phone number. It's what the phone book is made for. However, it gets a little trickier, or a lot trickier really, if I asked you to do something like find everyone in the phone book who has the first name Ned. There isn't an easy way to do this. You basically would have to go through every entry in the book and check for however many thousands there are. Is this person's name Ned? So I have a couple other questions that are similarly difficult. So the point here is just if you were to find all phone numbers with a particular area code or to find all people who have a 3-letter first name, it's not easy. And it would take a lot of time, like a ton of time. So that brings me to the next component of the definition of what makes something a database, in my opinion, which is not just a collection of data, it also contains a method for accessing and manipulating that data. So going back to this phone book, we would want a way, some sort of program or code that would allow us to do things like find everybody with the first name Ned, or find all people who have a 3-letter first name, or even do things like add a new person into the phone book, or change area codes or change phone numbers, or get crazy and just delete people from our phone book or delete everybody if we wanted to. We would have some sort of program or code as part of our database that would help with that would allow us to interface with the data. So I did say we were going to dive a little bit into jargon and terminology. I usually try and stay away from that early on. Well, I try and stay away from that in general, but especially early on in a course. Basically, if you've read about databases, if you've used one before, if you've read a blog post about them, you may have come across the term database management system, or relational database management system, or DMS, or RBDMS, all these different acronyms. Basically, this right here, what I have on the screen, database versus database management system, refers to the fact that what I just talked about, having data, a collection of data, and then having an interface for that data, are two different things. So let me show you a quick example. Imagine that you have an application. Let's say it is a dating app. And then you have a database, and you're storing all sorts of information, all the different users, all the different messages that have been sent, the photos, whatever else goes into your dating app. But on its own, the database here is basically like our phone book. It's a gigantic collection of data, which is great for storing data, but it really doesn't let us do very much. You can almost think of it as if it was a gigantic file on your computer. So for our application to be able to do things like update somebody's username in the database, or edit their profile photo, or delete a user if they want to leave our application, whatever it is, there's a database management system that allows us to interface with that database. So it's just the code or the program that does the talking to our database for us. So we talk to our database management system and it talks to the database. Okay, so for the most part, we're out of the weeds with the jargon here. The reason I brought this up though, is that oftentimes when people talk about a database, you actually hear them referring to both of these things, the database management system and the database together, just as a database. So what I have right here is a list of some of the more common databases you'll run into. And actually, I just did it there, what I was just talking about. These 4 things, Postgres, MySQL, Oracle, SQLite, they're not technically databases. They're actually database management systems. But for the most part, people just call them databases. So when we say things like, MySQL is one of the most commonly used databases, it's actually one of the most commonly used database management systems. So it's not the end of the world if you forget about that, but it is important because it will help you understand later on when we actually start talking about SQL, when we start talking about some of the code that you write to interact with the database. I think it will help you understand what you're doing and that you're giving commands to this database management system which then goes and gives commands to the actual data itself or to the database itself. Okay, so to wrap everything up, here's a little bit of a synthesized definition. What is a database? Well, it's a structured set of computerized data with an accessible interface. So in this video, we're going to talk about one of the more common questions that comes up early on, which is what is the difference between MySQL and SQL? Or I usually just say SQL, but what's the difference between these two? Obviously, SQL is contained in the name of MySQL. What's the significance of that? So let's start off with discussing SQL, which stands for Structured Query Language. So SQL is the language that we use when we talk to our databases. It's the way that we interact and access the data, update data, delete things, and basically manipulate the data in our databases. It's the language we use. So it's how we do things like find all users. Now what I'm showing you here is not actual SQL code. You'll see that in just a second. These are just humanized versions. Find all users who are 18 years old. Add a new user with username Jumbo Jim, or if we want to get crazy, delete every single user. So these are the sort of things that we use SQL to do. So we write these lines, which are called queries, structured query language. And once we hit enter, or once we run that SQL code, it's executed and it goes off and it talks to our database and it does it for us. So if you are curious of what it looks like, here's a really quick one-line preview. The English version, find all users who are 18 or older, is translated into this. Select star from users where age is greater than or equal to 18, semicolon. So hopefully that actually seems pretty straightforward. Now, we're going to dive into SQL all throughout this course. You don't need to worry about this exact statement. What's important, though, is that you can see there is a special syntax we use, and that this query here is going to be sent off to interact with the database somewhere. So the next point I want to make is that when we work with MySQL, we're actually writing SQL all the time. So MySQL is what we talked about earlier, a database management system, and there's a bunch of them out there. Here's some common ones: Postgres, SQLite, Oracle. There's hundreds of others. And there's dozens of popular ones, but hundreds of them all over the world that maybe aren't as popular. So all of these ones here that I've highlighted use SQL or SQL. That doesn't mean every database ever does, but what are called relational databases do. And we'll talk more about that later when we discuss tables. But for now, the point I want to make is that SQL is not unique to MySQL or to Postgres. That's why they all have this SQL in their name. They share this language. So structured query language, SQL, is a standard, basically, that these relational database management systems like MySQL implement. So it's kind of a lot of jargon and terminology again, but the main takeaway is that when we use something like MySQL, we'll actually be writing SQL all the time. So here's an example of what a line of SQL code looks like to do the exact same thing in a MySQL database and a Postgres database. Here's the MySQL, and here's the Postgres. And hopefully you notice they are identical. Both of these are different database management systems. They have differences to them, but they both use SQL. You will be writing SQL when you interact with these databases. So just to hit that home, there are slight differences in the syntax. They are not identical, but they're very, very similar. Oh, and I better not forget to mention the SQL standard. So the way that this whole thing works is that there is a standard for how SQL should work. It's actually written down. You can read it online. And all of these different database management systems basically are tasked with implementing that standard in their own database and making it work. And they deviate sometimes a little bit, but for the most part, they're very, very similar. So the two takeaways here. One is that once you learn SQL, it's really not that hard to switch to another database that also uses SQL. So you're learning MySQL, you could pretty easily switch to Postgres or to SQLite with not a lot of time needed to get up to speed. And the second thing is that what makes databases or database management systems, to be specific, what makes them unique are the features that they offer, not the SQL or the language itself. So if we go back to this diagram, all of these use SQL, but that doesn't mean that they're identical. And yes, you might write the same line of code to do the same thing here. So what makes these different are the features that they implement. Things like how secure is one versus the other, or how fast is it? How big is the download? How do user permissions work? And on and on and on. And we'll talk more about what those differences are when we get to a point where they actually make a little bit more sense. I don't want to just talk at you. Okay, so this was about MySQL versus SQL. SQL is structured query language. It exists separately from MySQL. And MySQL is a database management system that implements SQL. Alrighty, so we've spent a healthy amount of time talking about the higher level things, kind of setting the stage for this course. Why should you care about databases? What are databases? What's MySQL? Where's that fit in? What's SQL? And so on. Now it's actually time for us to really get going. So hopefully that's a little bit exciting. Unfortunately, the first thing we have to do is install the tools, install MySQL on your computers. So I want to add a note really early on, which is that in my experience, installing anything can be a pain. And that's true for someone who is an experienced developer all the way down to a complete beginner. It's always a potential point of friction where things can go wrong. And nothing is more frustrating than being excited to do something, being excited to learn something new, and then have it not work, or have to spend hours trying to figure out why it's not installed correctly and what's going on. In my opinion, it's one of the worst parts of being a developer. And then also in my experience teaching, I've seen a lot of people get discouraged really quickly when something doesn't work out. If you're unable to install MySQL when you want to learn MySQL, it might just send you in a different direction, and you might end up learning another database like SQLite that doesn't require as much setup, and that's easier to install. So we don't want that to happen. Nothing against SQLite, but this is not a course on SQLite. So I just wanted to put that out there, that keep in mind, installing can be a pain, but I'm going to do my best to try and make it painless. So we have three options. The first one for installation is to install it on a PC. So if you have a PC, if you're a Windows user, you can follow those instructions. The next option, as you probably guessed, is that you can install it on a Mac. So if you're following along using a Mac, this would be a good choice for you. But there's also a third option, which is to install it using a service called Cloud9. So if you've taken my other course, you may be familiar with Cloud9. It's basically an online interactive development environment. In just a couple of videos, I'll go into some more detail about it. And before we go any further, I just want to highlight that installing using Cloud9 is without a doubt the best and easiest way to get started, and it's what I recommend that you use, which is why I spent so much time drawing this little box around it. Install on Cloud9. So why is that? Why do I recommend that you use Cloud9? There's a couple reasons. The first is that it's what I'll be using in the course. So rather than doing everything on a Mac and confusing the Windows people, or doing everything on a PC and confusing people on a Mac, I'm going to use Cloud9, which is something that anybody can use regardless of the type of machine that you own, how old it is, how much RAM you have, what operating system, that doesn't matter. It levels the playing field. So because I'll be using it in the course, I think it makes it a lot easier for you to follow along. Now, if you're someone who's pretty confident as a developer, of course, feel free to install it however you'd like. But I highly, highly recommend that you use Cloud9, at least early on, because you'll be able to follow along much, much easier. And the second reason, equally important, is that it's way easier for you to get help if something goes wrong. If you're doing a project or an exercise and something doesn't seem to be working the way you expect, or you hit a bug, or you're just not sure what you did wrong, you can easily share a link to your environment through Cloud9 and post that on our discussion boards, and either me or one of the TAs can help you out. So it's way easier for you to get help. If you were just working on your PC or Mac and you're trying to explain what's wrong, you're going to have to take some screenshots, you're going to have to upload them, you might have to copy and paste some stuff from your terminal. But if you use Cloud9, and I'll show you this when we talk about Cloud9 in more depth, you can just take the link of your workspace and share that, and anyone will be able to look at your code and diagnose a problem. And the third reason that I didn't write down, and this is a really important one, is that installation is basically painless. You have to sign up for an account, and that's about the worst part. Once you're past that, it's one command to get MySQL working, which is pretty amazing. So with all of that said, this is my recommendation or prescription for how you should go about this course. Use Cloud9 to follow along throughout the course. So everything that I do in Cloud9, you'll be able to replicate yourself in Cloud9. And then once we finish the course, you can return back to the installation instructions and then install it on your Mac or your PC natively. So I'll talk about what that means, what's the difference between installing natively versus Cloud9 when we talk more about Cloud9 in just a little bit. So that's my recommendation. I highly, highly recommend that you start with Cloud9 and then later on, if you'd like, move to working on your PC or your Mac. All right, so enough about that. Let's get down to business. All right, so in this video, we're going to go over the specifics of setting up Cloud9. Now, just to recap, Cloud9 is a cloud-based developer environment. So what that means is that it contains everything you need to create applications and have databases, basically a terminal alongside of a text editor, all in one inside of your browser, so that you can instantly get, and I know I sound a bit like a marketing shill for Cloud9, I promise I'm not. We don't have any sort of deal. I wish we did. But what it lets you do is get something going really quickly and very, very painlessly. So the first step is to sign up for an account. So if you visit the URL c9.io, or you click on the link in the description, but it's a pretty short URL, c9.io, you should see this page if it's your first time visiting and you don't already have an account. If you already have an account from another course, you can wait until the next step where we create our new workspace. So if you don't have an account, all you have to do is enter your email, hit sign up. You'll have to fill in some information, pick a username, choose the kind of developer that you are, choose how you'll use Cloud9, click next. Make sure your details are correct. Now this is where some people may panic, but don't panic. It asks you for credit card information. Now, if you notice here, it does say that you will not be charged. So there is a perfectly functional free tier of Cloud9, but you do have to have a credit card to sign up this way. Now, as I said, don't panic, because if you don't have a credit card, which I know a sizable number of my students actually don't have credit cards. You may come from a country where credit cards aren't as prevalent. You may be too young to have a credit card, or you just may not have one for some other reason. And that's totally fine. It's not a barrier to using Cloud9. It's a little bit of a tiny hurdle. So there's a workaround. So Cloud9 offers educational accounts for teachers and instructors. And what that allows me to do, or allows you to do, is to sign up without having to use a credit card. Now, the only problem is that I have to manually add you in as a student under my educational workspace. So again, it does take a bit more time because either me or one of the TAs will have to manually add you in, but we're committed to doing that. We want to make sure that everyone can follow along, even if you don't have a credit card. Now, if you do have a credit card, I do recommend that you just fill this out because you will not be charged. And it's just going to be faster. You won't have to wait for me to wake up in the morning and check the discussion boards on Udemy. You'll just be able to get started right now. So once you've filled all that information in and completed the sign up process, you should see a screen like this, although you won't have any of these workspaces here. So in Cloud9, when you create a new workspace, what you're actually doing is creating a new developer environment, separate partitioned off environment that you can work in. So actually you can see here, I have a couple of different environments going. Some of these I use all the time, like the one for my Web Dev Bootcamp course. Some of them are just, here's a test that I made to see how a Ruby environment works in Cloud9. Or here's one where I installed MySQL, which is what we'll be doing in just a moment. So step 2 is to actually go ahead and create a workspace. So we click create a new workspace, and you're welcome to call your workspace whatever you want. I'm going to call it MySQL_course. And then I'll go ahead and set it to be public. It's up to you if you want your work to be private or public, but you don't really need to worry about anybody seeing what you're doing anyways. But if you do want to make it private, that is how Cloud9 makes some of their money. But I'm going to make mine public. Then we have these templates down here that we can choose from. So there are these presets that allow us to create a new developer environment really quickly. And that doesn't really matter for us in this case. So you can pick any of them, but I recommend you just pick HTML5. It's the simplest one. Basically, it's going to be an empty workspace for us. So then we click create workspace. We wait a little bit and wait a little more. And finally, once it's done, you should see something like this. So that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to talk about what this interface means and how we navigate it. All right, so now that we have our workspace set up, the next thing we want to do is take a really quick tour, 2 to 3 minutes, of how the interface for Cloud9 works. So once you've created the workspace, you should see a window that looks something like this. I did increase my font size to make it a little easier for you to read. So yours will probably look a little nicer, but otherwise they should look the same. Before we actually dive into the interface, I want to emphasize what actually happened when you created a workspace, because I think it's pretty cool. I mentioned that Cloud9 is a cloud-based developer environment. When you created that workspace, Cloud9 has a computer somewhere, a server, that made you a little bit of space just for your little developer environment and basically made you a section on a computer that's private for you. It only holds your stuff, your files. And right now, there are only 2 files in there, which we can see over here, helloworld.html and readme.md. Those are both just automatically created. The HTML file is created because we chose that HTML template. If we had chosen a Python, or let's say we chose a Ruby template, we would have a helloworld.rb file. But that doesn't really matter because we're going to get rid of both of them anyway. But the idea is that there is space actually on a computer somewhere that is running all of this. It has these files on it. When we install MySQL and get it running, it's not actually going to be running on your machine, or in this case, on my machine. It will be running on Cloud9's machine, and this is just a browser interface for me to talk to that machine, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. So that's enough of that. Now let's take a look at the interface. We have 3 main sections. The first one is what I'll call the file tree. It's basically a visual representation of the contents of your workspace. So as we already talked about, there's 2 files there right now. As we create new files and directories or folders in this course, you'll see them pop up over here. The next area I'll call your attention to is this middle area. I'll call it the text editor. So if we open up one of these files, like readme.md, which is what is currently open, if I double click that, it opens up, as you can see here, readme.md. Don't worry if you've never heard of Markdown. That's not super important at this point. But I can now go in and edit things. And if I hit save, on Mac, it's Command S. On a PC, Control S. So I can switch files to the HTML file by double clicking. And now opens up a tab here. I can go back to that other file. I'll close out of it. Now, you don't need to know HTML, of course, for this class, but the point here is that we have files, we can double click, and we can see them over here. The last thing that I'll show you before we move on to this bottom section is how to make a new folder or a new file. So what you can do is right-click on this space right here, and you can scroll down and find new file or new folder. So let's make a new folder, and I'll just call it testing. Then I can right-click again and go to new file. You can also do file, new file, just like you were working in a real text editor natively on your computer. But I tend to do this here, new file, and then I can call this whatever. I'll just say hello, and I'll make a txt file. Now to open it, I can double click, put whatever I want in there. Now, if I switch, you see that little dot? That means it's not saved. I can go back and save it and close out. And now we have 3 files over here, as well as a new folder. So that's pretty much all there is to the text editor area. And we'll be working with this later on when we're creating SQL files that we're writing our code in and then running all at once. Then the last section that I'll expand down here is the shell, or the terminal. If you're familiar with any sort of bash shell, this is exactly a bash shell. And if you're not, don't panic. I'll throw up that little don't panic thing again. You don't have to know that for this course because of the way Cloud9 works. We have this visual interface for navigating our folders and files. But it definitely is not a bad idea to learn some basic terminal commands. I'll include a link to some of my favorite resources for learning that if you'd like. But again, you do not have to know how to navigate the terminal to do this course. But just to show you that this is a full-fledged terminal, I can do things like ls to list all the files in my current directory. And you can see I have readme, hello world.html, and testing. I can change directory into testing. And now if I type ls, I get hello.txt. So I'm inside this directory. And I can do things like print working directory. Now we will be running commands from this terminal mainly to initialize MySQL, as well as work with the MySQL interactive shell, and a whole bunch of other things. But those will be MySQL specific commands, not the general bash commands. So that's pretty much all there is to the interface at this point. We have the file tree, where we can double click to view files over in the editor. We can make changes there. And then we also have the terminal down here, which we'll be working with quite a bit as well. Next up, we have an optional, really quick activity. If you just want to get a little bit of practice with Cloud9, if you're feeling a little bit out of your element or uncomfortable with the interface, here's a really quick activity. So there's just 5 steps. Make a new folder in your Cloud9 workspace, call it whatever you want. Then inside of that folder, create 2 new files, whatever type of file. TXT is probably easiest, and name them whatever you'd like. Add some text to one of the files, and then delete both the files, and then delete the folder. So not the most exciting, I know, but it's good practice. If you'd like to do that, go ahead and do it now, and then in just a couple seconds, I'll have a solution.
3, 2, 1. Pencils down.
All right, so to make a new folder, we can just right click, new folder, and we'll just call it my folder. Then to make a new file in that folder, we can right click again on the folder this time, and we'll just call this one 1.txt, and we'll create another one. And actually this time, I'll show how to create it using the terminal, which is not a requirement. So I will navigate using cd and ls to the my folder directory. Then inside of here, I will create a new file called 2.txt, and I use the command touch. Again, don't freak out if you're not familiar with that. I'm just showing it to you just in case you are someone who likes to use the terminal. Okay, so that, as you can see, made a new file up here. Let's go into one of them, double click, add some text, blah, blah, blah. We'll save, close out of it, just to make sure it's there. We'll double click again. This other one's empty. Looks good. Now the next step is to delete the files. And this is not something that I actually covered in the previous video, but I do think it's pretty self-explanatory. You right click, you'll scroll down and click on delete. That's one way of doing it. It's going to ask you if you're sure you want to remove it. It can't be undone. We'll click yes. You can also use the command line if that's something you'd like to do. Use the rm command, and you can see it disappeared. And then lastly, delete the folder, right click, and we can click on delete. You could also do it from the command line as well. And that's it. So we finally arrived at the moment where we actually start working with MySQL. And by start working with, I mean we're just going to install it and make sure it's running correctly on our Cloud9 instance. but still, it's something. So before we dive into that, I just want to show you a post on the Cloud9 community. This is written by one of the employees at Cloud9, and he's explaining how to use MySQL inside of Cloud9, inside of a workspace. And basically what it talks about is that they've created at Cloud9 a really quick and easy way to get MySQL running in one of your workspaces. It's much, much easier than what you would need to do to install it on your own. They have a nice little shortcut. There are 3 commands that we'll talk about. They're the 3 that are here. Basically, start, stop, and CLI. But before we go any further, I just want to point out that these are not general MySQL commands that you can run on any machine anywhere. These are actually Cloud9 specific. So the upside of this is that they've made it really, really easy, like almost too easy to get going with MySQL. You just run these commands and you're there. It's kind of magical. The slight downside of that is that it doesn't work on every single machine, and it is Cloud9 specific. So when you do install on a Mac or on a PC, you'll just have to relearn a new command to do basically the same thing. But for now, since we're in Cloud9, we get to appreciate how easy it is. So the first command is mysql-ctl space start. And you'll notice that the 3 commands we're going to take a look at all start with this mysql-ctl. And I believe it stands for command line tool, CTL. It's just the abbreviation that Cloud9 came up with. So this first one, if we look at their documentation, it tells us it starts MySQL and it will create an empty database the first time you start it. So let's give it a shot. You might notice that I cleared out everything in this directory. I got rid of those 2 starter files. You don't have to do that, but I just wanted to get rid of clutter. So we're going to write mysql-ctl space start. You can see it's hard at work installing MySQL. It's starting up a server. It's doing a few other things. Don't need to worry too much about that. It tells us a root user is my account name. Our database name is C9. It created a database for us. Again, we'll dive more into this in the next section when we actually start talking about databases and how you create them and work with tables and write SQL. For now, all that we really care about is that something happened, which is good. So the next command is the same thing, mysql-ctl space, this time CLI, and that stands for Command Line Interface. And what this will do is it will start up the MySQL interactive shell. And if you've worked with any database before, usually there's an interactive shell that goes along with it. Or if you've worked with things like Ruby or Python or Node, there are usually terminal or command line based interactive environments. If this is all new to you, I think it's easiest to understand it just by using it and taking a look at it. So now let's try this again. This time, mysql-ctl space CLI. And we hit enter. So now we have a bunch of new text. Welcome to the MySQL monitor. Commands end with semicolon, and we'll come back to that in just a second. Tells us our MySQL connection, server version, copyright, gives us a little copyright notice here. And now we're inside of what's known as the MySQL interactive shell or the monitor. So this is where we can go to actually type commands. So if you think back to the telephone book example, this is where we would go and say things like, find me all users in our database who have a first name that is 3 characters long, or find me all users in our database who are 18 years or older. So this is where we can go to type code to interact with and access a database, but it's also where we can go and type code that works more on like a meta level. You can think of it as doing things around permissions, creating entirely new databases, transferring data from one database to another. There's a whole bunch of things we do in this shell, and we'll be working with this quite a bit. So for now, we're not going to do that. We're going to wait until the next section. All that we're going to see right now is that you can quit this. There are quite a few ways of quitting the shell. We can use exit, notice a semicolon, quit, also notice a semicolon. We can use \q. I always mix up forward and backslash, but this slash pointing down Q, or what I usually use, Control C. So whatever works best for you. I think there are actually a couple more different ways of quitting, depending on the platform you're using. But for me, I usually use Control C. But just to illustrate that, I'll do 2 of them. So let's do quit, semicolon. We get a nice message, bye. Seems a little sad. We can restart the CLI by either retyping that whole thing or just hitting the up arrow. So I'm going to do that now and hit enter. We get this exact same message. You'll see it every time. This time I'm going to use Control C. You'll just have to trust me I did it. Actually, you won't, because you can see it here. Control C. This time it says aborted. So it turns out there actually is a little bit of a difference. If you notice up here, it said bye. It kind of was expecting to quit because I used the quit command. And here I just ended the process, which is why it says aborted. So technically there's a difference, but I just used Control C because you don't have to really type anything. It's much easier. You don't have to hit the enter key. You don't need a semicolon. Really, whatever you prefer. Some people like to be more explicit and use quit or exit. Okay. So the last command that we're going to take a look at is mysql-ctl space stop. And you're really, really rarely going to use this one, but what this one will do is stop the MySQL process completely. So to understand what that means, it helps to understand what happened when we typed this first command here that started everything. So what that did is that it started up a new instance of MySQL. Then that's running constantly in the background at all times until we stop it. When we use this second command, mysql-ctl CLI, I know it's a lot of abbreviations here, but when we use that CLI command, it is connecting to the instance of MySQL that was started up from the first command. So just to reiterate, this CLI, when we do this and start it up, it is connecting to the MySQL connection that we started up earlier. So I'll exit. And if we wanted to, we can stop that background process. We can stop MySQL from running completely. So we're not just stopping the CLI. This is already stopped here, but we can stop everything related to MySQL using mysql-ctl stop. And it just tells us stopping MySQL database server, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so 3 commands. Realistically, the way that this will work is that we'll start it up and we're going to leave it running for basically the entire course. And we're going to start and stop the CLI all the time. Pretty much every other video will be starting up the CLI, typing some code, quitting. So you should get used to that, but you don't really need to worry about stopping it all that often. Okay, so next up, we just have a quick little exploratory activity where you'll be able to type some new commands into the CLI and see what happens. Okay, so as I mentioned in the last video, we're going to do a really quick activity where you're basically going to try experimenting with these 3 commands and enter them into the MySQL CLI. So if you stopped it, if you quit, make sure that you open it back up using the CLI command, and then try running these one at a time and just see what happens. So pause the video if you'd like and do that, and then come back, and in a few seconds, we'll go over what happens. All right, so let's start with the first one, help. So I'm going to clean up my terminal here just by using the clear command. Then I'm going to access the CLI. I'll just use the up arrow. So now I have this CLI, command line interface, ready for me to type some commands. So I will do that first one, which is help. And you can see we're actually prompted to type that. So when I hit enter, all it does is give me a list of commands of things that I can do. You can see we've got things like clear, help, which we just used, print, prompt. We've got quit, which we already used as well. Basically, it's just a list of things that you can do. As you can see, we can also try help contents. And we basically get a list of categories that we could access. So if we wanted to know more about, let's just pick one of these at random. Don't worry, let's try data types. We can do help data types. And it kind of dives down further and gives us information about what those are. We haven't talked about data types, so don't stress about that. The next command to try is show databases. So we'll come back, try that, show databases. And it gives us this nice little representation here of the current databases that we have in this instance of MySQL. So we haven't talked about how you make a new database. You might be wondering what's going on. There's already 5 of them here. All of those were created automatically when we created this MySQL instance. So don't worry, it doesn't really matter what they are right now, but they're there automatically. There are 5 different databases. In the next section, we'll actually talk about what a database is, when you create a new database, why you create a new one, when you use the same one. But I just wanted to show you this command because you'll be able to use it in the future. When you create a new database and you want to make sure it worked, you can type show databases and you should see a new one added below. And the final command here is select @ hostname. This is also kind of a weird one that most likely you will never type after this, but I just wanted to show it to you. Not because it's something you need to do, but just it's something that you can do quickly and immediately. And all of this here is just to illustrate the point that the CLI works by you typing commands, hitting enter, and getting some text back. So that process over and over and over. So here it tells me that my @hostname is this string here, basically my username. Yours will be different depending on your workspace and your username. So as I mentioned, it's honestly not important what it is or why it's there at this point, but I just wanted you to see that you can type these commands in and get something back out. So that's it for this really quick, kind of silly exercise. But in the next section, we're going to start actually learning SQL commands. So you'll be able to start interacting immediately, creating databases, creating new tables, adding data into those tables. And it gets a lot more interesting there, I promise.
Warning. This video may contain extremely frustrating installation instructions and is for experienced developers only. It's advised that you install using Cloud9 to avoid needless pain and anger.
Okay, welcome to this video on installing MySQL on a Mac. And again, I'll warn you, this can be painful. And this lecture and doing this, all these steps are 100% optional. In fact, if you don't have a good reason, if you're not sure if you should do this, then that means that you shouldn't do it. At least not until you get to the end of the course. Of course, if you're somebody who is an experienced developer and you know you want to get this running locally at the beginning on your Mac, then go ahead, follow these instructions. But I would definitely recommend that you go through the course. For 99.9% of the people in this class, go through the course with Cloud9 and then install this on your Mac at the end. It just makes everything so much easier. Okay, so if you're still here though, the steps to actually install it are surprisingly simple. The problem is once you install it, you run into issues depending on your developer environment, depending on things like if you're using Bash or Z Shell, if you have permissions issues and passwords, and it just turns into a nightmare a little bit. Well, not just a little bit, a lot. So the first thing we need to do, like I said, is actually nice and easy. Just go to mysql.com, go to the Downloads tab, and what you'll see here are a bunch of the basically like the commercial services and MySQL enterprise software that is not free. We want the community section. And then we want the first thing here, MySQL community server. Then at the very beginning, this is kind of just a blurb about it, some documentation, instructions. But if you keep scrolling down, you'll see the download links. So you'll need to select the one that corresponds to your Mac, depending on how old your Mac is, how new it is, what version of Mac OS it's running, all of that. You'll have to make a decision. But for me, it's this first one here. So I'll click download, and it looks like you have to type or you have to sign in or create an account, but that's not true. You scroll down and there's this link, no thanks, just start my download. Of course, if you want to, you can sign up, but most of you probably don't care. So just click no thanks, just start my download. And I'll see you in just a second once I edit this download timeout. All right, now that's completed downloading. So I'm just gonna open it up. Might take a second to open, But once it does, you'll see a single file inside of this. And we'll just double click, follow the steps, continue, read every word of this. Of course, I've already done it, so, I know everything it says. Click agree. Tells you 1.13 gigs of space needed, so make sure that you have that available. Then we'll click install. Then it will ask you for your password for your computer. Fortunately, I guess I can use my thumb or my finger. That way, you don't have to watch me type my password. I don't have to edit that out. It's always a problem. I don't want people to see my passwords. Okay, so here's an important part. I mean, it's all important, but this in particular, it gives you a little pop-up here that says a temporary password is generated for root at localhost, and then it gives you this password. So I don't highly recommend, you need to copy this. Technically, if you forget it or you lose it, you can reset the root password. It's just another set of steps and complications. So copy this, save it. Okay, we're now done installing it. I'm going to move it to the trash. So we're done with the install, but that's the easy part, just a couple of clicks. Now we need to do a couple things. The first is start up the server. So to do that, we go to System Preferences, and it should be down here. There should be a new icon somewhere, at least depending on how you have yours set up. For me, it's the bottom left, MySQL. I'll click on that, and we should see MySQL server status, blah, blah, blah. The server instance is currently stopped. There's a button to click to start it, which will start it. And then there's also this checkbox, which I'll address now. Depending on what you want, you can have MySQL server start up every time you start your computer. I'm not going to do that. You have to type your password again. I have like 6 or 7 database servers on here, and I just don't want any of them to start up on this machine, at least. This is not my developer machine. This is what I use for teaching. Totally up to you. Just depends on how you're using it. But if you're just learning MySQL now, it might actually be good to leave that on so you don't have to continually start it. But either way, it's not that hard to start. It's just a button here, which we'll click now. And there we go. If you didn't click this or uncheck this, you may have to type your password when you click that the first time. Okay, so now what we have left to do is open up our terminal and start interacting with this. So I'm going to bring the font size up a bit. And theoretically, you should be able to type MySQL. But this is where we start running into issues. So I'm getting this command not found. And if you get this, again, this depends on how your Mac is set up and your developer environment. And this is where it's annoying. But for me, I'm using something called Z shell. I'm getting command not found. And that's because the MySQL command it's not in my path. So what I need to do now, I'll open up my ./.zhrc file, and I'll paste this line in here just so you can see it. I'll include this in the instructions for this lecture. You can find this on anywhere online. It's a very common error when people type MySQL and you get command not found. In fact, if we just did that right now, I went to Google, you can see, depending on what version of OS X you're running, there's all sorts of replies that are basically exactly what I just did. In fact, that's where I got the line originally. It just depends on if you're using Bash, and if you are, then you can use a line like this. But essentially, there's all these possibilities depending on your environment, so I can't cover all of them here. But find the correct command for you to run, and that's only if you're getting command not found. All right, so we need to save this file, close it down, go back to terminal. Then the next thing, I'm just going to close the window and reopen it, or you can quit terminal, or you can source your profile. Now what I need to do is try MySQL again. Okay, so now we have a different problem. And this is it's not a great problem, but this is the problem we should have. Access denied for user Colt Steele at localhost. Using password, no. The problem is, if you remember, well, first of all, this means that MySQL, the command is found, it's running, but we're getting a result now. And the problem is that I'm trying to start MySQL and I don't have permission. I need to log in as the root user. And remember, we saved that password. So I went and copied that password that we were told to save. It's on my clipboard now. I can paste it, but that won't do anything. What we need to do is run mysql-u space root-p and hit enter. And it should prompt you for the password. You can paste that in. And we're in. All right. So if you get this far, congratulations. Everything's working. If you didn't get to this point, it's likely because of a couple of reasons. One is that you're still getting that command not found issue. That one is relatively easy to fix. The problem is you have to be comfortable using your command line and opening up hidden files like a bash profile or your zhrc file. The other problem you could run into is this permissions thing. And if you didn't save that password that I told you should save, but if you didn't, or you close the window accidentally, you can reset the root password. All you need to do is go online and Google it. There's a couple of posts online about it. Basically, what you do is you run mysql-u space root, and there's something called flush privileges, a command, and you can update your password with a new password. There's a couple things you can do like that. Basically, rather than me making a video for every possibility, it's much better if you just find it out online. And this is why I recommended that you use Cloud9. I promise they're not paying me. It's just that this is difficult, especially in an online setting. Okay, so you might think we could start running some MySQL code. Like if you tried, here's something we haven't actually seen yet, but if you tried this, or actually, how about show databases? So this would show us a list of databases, and if there are no databases, it should still show us something. But instead, we get this. You must reset your password using alter user statement before executing this statement. Okay, so our final hurdle here. What we need to do is, I have a command that I just had on my clipboard, but it looks like this. Alter user, in quotes, root at, and then in quotes, localhost, identified by, and then all you need to do is provide a password here, in quotes, that you would like to use for the root user for your MySQL install, or for this server instance. And so just type something. I'm just going to make mine password. There we go. And hit enter. Oh, with a semicolon. Now, if we get the query okay, things should be working. If I try my show databases command, this time we're in. I don't get this permissions problem. Phew. Okay, it worked out. So again, that command I'll also include in the instructions if you need to do that. It's just alter user root at localhost identified by password. Okay, so then the last thing is, if you want to close out, by the way, it's Command D, which we'll be covering all this. If you're going through the course for the very first time and this is how you decide to start, we'll actually go over these commands in the next section when we install everything, or once we have everything installed and we start talking about MySQL. But we need to be able to verify the install, so there's a couple commands. Okay, so now if I wanted to try logging in again, I shut it down. It's mysql-u root-p, and then it will ask me for my password, which I changed to password. So you'll type that. You won't actually see it, but if you type it correctly, you're in. Okay, so that is our journey to installing MySQL on a Mac. Great time. Hopefully, if you got to this point, you made it through and everything worked out. If not, if you're just starting this course off, I still highly recommend that you switch to using Cloud9. Avoid all of these issues and then come back to this when you feel more confident. Otherwise, if you absolutely have to use a Mac, we'll try our best to help you out. Anyways, moving on.
Warning. This video may contain extremely frustrating installation instructions and is for experienced developers only. It's advised that you install using Cloud9 to avoid needless pain and anger.
All right, if you're still here after the stern warning, I'll talk about how to install MySQL on Windows. Of course, remember, you will probably run into some sort of issue depending on your computer and what you have installed already. It can be difficult. So that's why I really recommend that you use Cloud9. Skip Windows until the end of the course. Okay, that's enough. I'm a broken record. Let's get started. So to install MySQL on a PC, we need to go to mysql.com and then click on the download section and then click on community. And under community, you can actually click on any of these. If you click on download, what it's going to suggest for you if you're a Windows user is that you actually use the MySQL installer rather than downloading things individually. Basically, it's a package that will help install a bunch of MySQL things all at once that you may or may not use, that you may or may not need. Make sure that you have the correct version selected depending on your architecture, then click download. And it looks like it starts downloading, but it actually doesn't. You have to click another button at the bottom, no thanks, just start my download. And then I'll fast forward through this. It takes a little bit to download depending on your internet, but then once it's done, all we want to do is open it up, run the installer. Okay, so then we have a couple options. We're going to select developer default and then click next. And then depending on what you have installed on your computer, you may need to actually install some other requirements. So I did here. So I basically had to go through a couple times, double click, click execute, wait for something else to go install, in this case Visual C++, and then I had to repeat that a couple of different times. Now that will probably be different for you and your machine. But then once that finishes, click on execute again, and this will actually start the installation process. So there's a bunch of components installing, but once they're complete, click next, and then we move on to configuration. And all we really care about is configuring the server. So we'll click next again, basically click next another time. We don't need to change anything. And further, another time, click next. Okay, so we're now at the point where we need to decide on a root password for MySQL. So you can decide on whatever you'd like. I just chose password, the word password. It's not a good password, but I wanted to make it simple, easy to remember. So you type it in twice, tells me that it's weak. And then I'm also going to add a user here. You don't have to do this. I'm just going to make one with the name Colt, and also the password will be password. And then confirm the password, also tells me that it's weak, and I'll click OK. So really all that you need to do is remember whatever password you typed for the root, and then click next, and then we'll click next one more time, and then finally again we'll click execute, and it will start to apply the configuration, and it may take a moment or two, but then once it finishes, everything should be installed. So we'll click finish and then get out of here. So that's how we install. The next important thing is starting up the command line client, which you can find just under MySQL command line client. Click on it, and then you'll need to enter your root password, which in my case was password. And now we're able to actually type some code, something like show databases, which we haven't talked about, but you can type code in there. You can also try typing things that aren't SQL, and you'll see you get error messages, but all that we really need to care about is that we have the command line client up and running, and we can type stuff into it. Hey there, it's me again. It's time for yet another one of these videos. This time we are diving into section 3, a really important section. And yes, you could probably say that about everything in this course, but this is where we really get going. It's really crucial. In the last section, it's true, we did run our first MySQL commands, but if we're being honest, they're a little bit underwhelming, kind of lame, they didn't do much. In this section, that actually changes. We see our first commands around data. So we'll be able to make a new database or delete a database, and then inside of those databases, we'll start working with tables, which are kind of the fundamental structure in all of SQL and MySQL. So really important stuff. And by the end of the section, well, actually throughout the entire section are sprinkled a bunch of exercises around commands that we'll learn, things like creating databases, using and switching to databases, and then creating tables and describing tables. So a bunch of challenges coming up. But like I said, this is a really important turning point where we actually get past all the garbage around setting stuff up, installing. Now we're actually doing real MySQL stuff. So let's get going. Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about how you actually create new databases in MySQL, finally. So before we go into the code, let's set the stage just a little bit. Currently, we have a MySQL database server represented by this box that's running on our Cloud9 instance. So that's what happened when we did the MySQL-CTL start. That started up the database server. So now the command that I'm going to show you is what allows us to create individual databases inside of the MySQL database server. So hypothetically, we could have a database for a dog walking app, another one for a soap shop. We could have a practice database if you were just practicing some new code, some new lines of SQL you wanted to try out. And maybe there's a news site database, and they're all hosted, they're all part of the same database server, but they're individual databases inside. And that's really important. And to understand why, let's zoom in a little bit on two of the databases, our dog walking app database and a soap shop database. So inside of those two databases, we'll store various entities or different data. So in the dog walking database, we'll probably need to store information about dogs. And in our soap shop database, we'll need to store something about soaps. And then here's where it gets really important. Our dog walking app likely has users, but so does our soap shop app. And our dog walking app has payments, and so does our soap shop app. So they have to be separated. If we just had one database that everything was using on this server, there would be a lot of crossover and there would be issues. What if you had somebody who had the same name who used your dog walking app and they also used the soap shop app, and the streams got crossed, if you will? That's problematic. So what we're going to learn now is how to create these individual walled off databases inside of the MySQL server we have running. Okay, so let's take a look at some code. This first line here, we've already seen before. All that it does is list the current databases that exist in the MySQL server. So when we do it right now, if I need to start up MySQL, CTL, CLI, and I type show databases, we get this list of the 5 pre-existing ones that we have nothing to do with. We didn't create these manually. The next piece of code is create database, followed by the name of the database you'd like to create. So in this course, whenever there's a variable, I'll use these brackets to signify that it's just a placeholder. So in this case, whatever the name of your database is, and then a semicolon. So to make a database for our soap store, we might name it soap_store. Or for our dog app, we could use dog app, and you don't have to use underscores. You can capitalize things if you would like. There's no rules governing that exactly. However, if you did something like this, while it can work, it's just not a good idea to do it. So that gets X'd out. I don't recommend doing it. Actually, my recommendation is to stick with this here, what's called snake case. Everything's lowercase and just use underscores instead of spaces. But it's totally up to you. Like I said, there's not a hard rule. And what's more important is that you are just consistent. So whatever you choose, just make sure that you continue to use that just to avoid any confusion. So let's hop over to our terminal and give it a shot. So I'm going to just make my first database, and I will call it Hello World DB. And remember that semicolon. And if we wanted to make sure that it worked, we can just run that show databases command again. And now you'll see a new addition, Hello World DB. A note about capitalization. When I wrote create database, yes, you can get away with doing create database. Hello, and let's call this one testing DB. That works just fine. So whenever you see those capitalized letters in SQL commands, you do not have to use them. But I like to use them, and a lot of people like to use them just to signify what comes from SQL and then what is a custom name. So in this case, testing DB is something I wrote, or Hello World DB is a database name or a table name down the line, or a column name once we get there. And we can tell that because it's not capitalized. And then create database is in all caps. It tells us that's just regular old SQL. Okay, so that's pretty much it to creating a database. That doesn't really give us very much, but we've basically made a space on the server where we can add data. We just don't know how to do that yet. So we've just partitioned off a little area and we've given it a name of Hello World DB, or in our second example, testing DB. So we've seen how to create a database, and the natural next step is to see how to delete one. It's pretty simple. The command is drop database, and then whatever the name of the database is that you're looking to delete. So we'll come across this term drop here a couple of times in the course. It's basically the SQL version of delete, and we'll be able to use it to drop things other than just a database. We'll be able to delete tables, for instance, once we get there. So let's try it out. Back in Cloud9, when I ran show databases, here are 2 that I created. I'm not going to delete any of the pre-existing ones. I just don't want to mess with that. So we will delete both of these though, Hello World DB and testing DB. So let's do that now. Drop database, Hello World DB, semicolon. And you can tell that it works, first of all, because it said query OK. But then also, if I recall show databases, this time hello world DB is gone. Let's do the same thing, drop database for testing DB. This time I'm going to leave off a semicolon, not because it's a good idea, but just to remind you that your code will not execute until you add that in there. It doesn't matter that it's on a separate line. We'll be writing multi-line queries just a little bit. What does matter is that it's there at all. It's what indicates that you're done and that it should run. So we can just double check that it worked. Now our testing DB is gone as well. So that's all there is to dropping a database. Pretty straightforward command. All right, so we saw how we can create databases and destroy them. So what comes next? We're going to see how we actually use them. And I mean that in a very literal sense. In MySQL, there is a use command. And what this does is it tells MySQL which database we want to be working with. So we have potentially 10 different databases on one MySQL server, and we want to search some data from one of them. Well, we need to tell MySQL which one we want to be using at any given time. And we can switch between them using the use command that you see right here. So I'll really quickly show you how it works over in Cloud9. So if we create a new database, and we'll just call this one dog walking app, and we hit enter, we do show databases, there it is. And if I want to use that, all I have to do is type use dog walking app. And you won't see much except for database changed. That's a good thing. But if we wanted to know for sure what database we are currently using, there's another MySQL command that we can use. And that command looks like this. Select database with parentheses after it. And what this will do is tell you the currently used database. So let's try that out. Back in Cloud9, if I type select database with those parentheses and a semicolon, it tells me database is dog walking app. And if I decided to delete that database, I would use the drop database dog walking app command. It tells me query OK. I do show databases and it should be gone. But if I do my select database command, pause and think to yourself for a moment, what database do you think I'll be using right now? We were using the dog walking app, but then we deleted it. So now what? And here's the answer. Kind of a trick question. We're not using a database right now, hence the null here. And we'll be talking a bit more about null throughout this course, but that basically means we're not using any database. So just to show you one more time, if we switch, let's say I wanted to use one of these pre-existing ones like the C9 database. I'm not going to delete that, but if I wanted to, I just use C9. And now if I do my select database, it tells me database is C9. Okay, so that's all there is to using a database, and then also this select database command to see your current database. Next up, we'll start talking about tables and putting some data in these databases as soon as possible. So the next couple of videos are all about tables, which are the most important part of SQL. They are the true heart of using SQL. And in this first video, we'll start off by setting the stage, or setting the table, if you will let me get away with that, for how they work, what they are, and then we'll dive into data types next, and then we'll actually create tables and see the code that you use to create them. So let's get started. The first thing you should know is that a database is just a bunch of tables. So we've already created a couple of empty databases and deleted them as well, but what goes in them are just a bunch of tables. That's where the data is stored. As a short aside, this is in a relational database. So everything we're talking about that uses SQL, things like MySQL, Postgres, SQLite, those are relational databases, and they use tables. They use tabular data, but not every single database in the world does. And we'll see some examples of those later on. This course is not about those types of databases, but it helps to kind of bring them in to show you some contrast to what you're learning. So we'll see that later on. Just a short caveat there. So tables hold the data. That's my definition. If you want the boring Wikipedia definition, it looks like this. Tables are a collection of related data held in a structured format within a database. Hopefully you're still awake after that. But let's take a quick example using cats. So we're going to model some cats data using a table. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the cats table. Drum roll, please. Dum da da dum. I know it's pretty hilarious. You're probably falling out of your chair. All right, so the real cats table, at least in this context, doesn't have an apostrophe. Looks something like this. And of course, there's a million different ways we could break down the data for a cat, for modeling cats. In my case, I just went with name, breed, and age. So we could do plenty of other things like location, gender, is spayed, is neutered, that sort of thing. But just doing name, breed, and age. So I've put a couple of cats in here. We've got Blue, who's a Scottish fold, who's 1 year old. That's my cat. We've got Rocket, who is a Persian, who's 3 years old, totally made up. Monty, who's a tabby, who is 10 years old. That is my childhood cat. He's still kicking and biting people. We've got Sam, who is a munchkin. If you don't know what that breed is, look them up. They're pretty hilarious, although kind of sad. They have really stubby legs. Who is 5 years old. Also made that cat up. So, some terminology. When we're talking about tables and you hear the term columns, it's referring to the headers on that table. So what are the different components of data, the different pieces that have to be there? In our case, we have name, breed, and age. So those are the columns, and then the rows are the actual data in the table. So here's a row. Blue, the cat, is one row. Rocket is another row. Monty is another row. Sam is another row. I really wish those lined up correctly, but I just drove myself nuts trying to get it to work. Please forgive me. Anyways, so databases are made up of lots and lots of these tables. It's usually not just one. And if you have a really, really simple app and you're just storing one thing, then it will just be one. But usually apps are pretty complicated and data is complicated. All that we modeled there was cats, but imagine if this was actually an app. Let's say it was a pet sitting app and cats were one thing that we had to keep track of, but we also have to keep track of owners and the pet sitters and addresses and dates and appointments and payments, and those are all going to be tables. Some of them might even be multiple tables. But for now, we're not going to really worry too much about that. But just to show you, sometimes it does get crazy. You can click this link, or I'll click it, follow my own instructions, to see the breakdown of some of the tables that Facebook's database or a social network might use in their database. So this is not actual, this is not 100% accurate. There are things that are missing or incomplete, but this just shows all the different tables, or at least some of the different tables involved in a pretty complex app. So as you can see, there's a bunch of them here. Things like account and event and message and notification, website, screen name, address, blah, blah, blah. All these different things to take into consideration. So things can get messy. And as we progress in this course, you will start working with multiple tables. You'll see how they connect. But we haven't even seen how to create a single table yet. So we're going to focus just on individual tables, and then we'll move on from there. So the next thing we need to discuss around tables are data types. So data types are really, really important. And to show you what I mean, and first of all, what I'm talking about when I say data types, let's return back to our cats table. So we have these three headers, three columns: name, breed, and age. And here's an example. I changed some of the data just a little bit. So the names are the same, the breeds are the same. But if you look over at age, Blue is 1 year old, Rocket is 3, but Monty now is 10, the word 10. And Sam is crazy. Sam's age is
I am young cat.
So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that we have inconsistent data. This is all text in text, but here we've got numbers mixed with text, and that is not good, and it's actually not allowed in SQL at all. When you create a new table, you actually have to specify name has to be text, breed has to be text, age has to be a number. And there are a whole bunch of different data types. It's not just text and number. In fact, those aren't even data types. Those are just what I'm calling them, the English version, but you'll see them in just a second. But to illustrate why it's so important that your data matches, that you don't have this inconsistent data, and why SQL forces you to do this, here's a little example. So let's say that you have this data in your database in a cats table where hypothetically in a fictional world, you can have data that isn't all matching. So we have this, numeric data mixed with text under age. So let's say I wanted to make a really, really simple app that would take each cat's age in the database and then print out the converted or equivalent cat age. So from human years to cat years, basically, which is sort of interesting. Actually, in making these slides, I learned quite a bit about how you calculate cat age, because for dogs, there's this colloquialism, you can just multiply it by 7. For cats, it's a little more complex. Apparently, it's not linear. So if you look at this scale, when a cat is 2 months old, it's 3 years in human years. But then as they get to 2 years old, it's suddenly 24. And when they're 14, it's 72. So it's not consistent. So I just decided, you know what, let's just go with multiplying by 7. It really doesn't matter. So our app takes the age of Blue, multiplies by 7, no problem. Our app takes 3, multiplies that by 7, no problem. But it has no idea what to do here. Our code doesn't expect text, and it can't do the math. And same thing with
I am young cat.
times 7. It doesn't even know what to do. It just freaks out. So really trivial, stupid example, I know. But the idea here is important, that we have to have these data types established and that MySQL will enforce them. So when we create tables, we have to say exactly what data type we're looking for, because this type of situation is really, really not good, also known as bad. So returning to our cats table, when we're creating it, we'll have to say, this must be text, breed must be text, and age must be a number. So in reality, there are a lot of different MySQL data types. Like I said, text and number are not real data types. In fact, there are a ton, in my opinion, too many, and it gets pretty confusing, especially when you're just starting out. It can be intimidating. Just to show you exactly what I'm talking about, I put together a list of all the different data types. So all the numeric types, basically the different ways of representing numbers. We've got ints, small ints, tiny int, medium int, big int, decimal, numeric, float, double, bit. Then under string types, so these are ways of representing text basically, char, varchar, binary, var binary, blob, tiny blob, medium blob, long blob, text, tiny text, medium text, long text, and then enum. And then finally, we've got date types, so different ways of representing dates. We've got date, date time, timestamp, time, and year. So yeah, it's kind of crazy, I know. Fortunately, you don't have to know all of those at any given time. Absolutely not. I had to spend a decent amount of time even digging through the documentation just to find all of these, because the reality is you don't use them most of the time, or you don't use all of them. You figure out which ones you need depending on a given situation. You use a subset normally that you're comfortable with, and then eventually you may have to switch things out and change from using a medium int to a big int, or actually more realistically an int to a big int or something like that. But we'll get there. For now, we're going to accept that it's crazy, and we're just going to whittle it down and focus on 2. The first one is int for our numeric type, and then varchar for our string type. So to represent numbers, we're working with int, and then to represent text and strings, we'll work with varchar. So we'll start off with int. So int represents a whole number, so we can't use it for decimals. And it ranges up to this gigantic number here. Basically, it's big. However, if you need to store numbers larger than that, that's when you can start looking into some of these other data types, but like big int. But we're not going to worry about that, because for now, we're storing things like cat age. So this is an int. Here's another int. It can be negative, or 0, or big, or 42. So that's pretty much it to ints. Then varchar is a way of representing text or strings, and it's variable length. So you may have noticed that there was char on there and varchar. Well, char is a fixed length. So that means that everything in that column has to be the same length. It has to be 10 characters or something. But varchar allows us to have a variation in that, which is what we want most of the time. And it's between 1 and 255 characters. So things like coffee or negative 9,999, the string in quotes. So it's not a number. Or this, whatever this is. Or capital L. Or a sentence, as long as it's fewer than 255 characters. So returning to our cats table, we would say that name, which must be text, would be varchar. And notice that I have these parentheses here and a number inside. So when you use varchar, you have to specify a maximum length. So in my case, I chose 100. I could go up to 255, but I just don't want to have any giant names. But that's all that it does here. So it specifies where the cutoff point is. And if I go beyond 100 characters, if I write 300 or 200 characters, all that will be stored is from the first character to the 100th character. So breed, I did the same thing. It's varchar, and I did 100 again, but that could change. If we wanted to restrict breeds to be shorter, we could change it to be 50 characters. And then for age, which must be a number, we just use int. We're just working with whole numbers. We're not going to worry about my cat is 1.2 years old or anything like that. Okay, so that's all we're going to do for now with data types. Basically, a high-level overview, and we saw two of them in particular, varchar and int. Next up, we have a really quick activity. So as I mentioned, we have a really quick activity now, and the point here is to get you thinking about data types and thinking in data types or in terms of data types. So what I'd like you to do is draw or write or just think about a tweets table. So modeling tweets. If you're not familiar with Twitter, that's going to be a tough one, I guess. But basically, there are three things I need you to, at least three things that I want you to model. And these are the columns. So a username. So when someone tweets, let's say I tweet and I don't actually use Twitter, but if I had an account and I called it Coffee Lover Colt, I mean, that's just terrible. But if I did, it would need to be maximum 15 characters long. So how do you specify that? What data type is it? Then the content of the tweet, so whatever the tweet is itself, can't be more than 140 characters. And then the number of people that have favorited that tweet, basically liked it or hearted it. So you don't have to draw it out, but if you want to draw it out in that tabular format and then fill in some fake data or even real tweet data that you find, go ahead and do that. But just think about what these data types are in terms of what we just learned. And there's really only two choices that we saw, so hopefully it's not too difficult. So we'll be right back with a solution. Okay, so let's start talking about the answer. So we had username, which was a maximum of 15 characters. That would be a varchar, and you would put 15 in the parentheses to specify that it's no more than 15 characters. Then we have content of the tweet, max of 140. It's very similar. It's also varchar, it's text, but this time we restrict it at 140 characters. Then we have favorites, which is just a number, so we use int. And then here's some mock data that I added if you want to take a look. We have cool guy who tweeted my first tweet, and that was one person who liked it or favorited it. Then we have guitar queen who tweeted I love music, smiley face, how endearing. And we have 10 favorites on that. And then lonely heart, this sad guy or gal who tweeted still looking for love, and that has 0 favorites because nobody wants to be depressed. All right, so next up, we're going to see how to take these data types and actually tell SQL or MySQL how to implement a table using those data types. So now that we've learned how tables work and we've seen a little bit about data types, we finally get to start creating tables. So here is the magic syntax for creating a new table in MySQL. Here is the generic version. So it's create table, and then the name of the table, so cats or users or people or results or whatever it is, and then in parentheses, a column name, and then a space, and the data type. And there are a few other things that can come along with the data type, but for now we're just talking about data type. So a column name like age is an int, or address is a varchar, or varchar, however you want to pronounce it. So that's the main idea. And you keep listing these columns, as many as you need. It could just be 1, it could be 20, and you separate them by by commas. And then when you finish, you add your semicolon, and that's that. Now you don't have to format it this way on separate lines, but I think it's easiest to understand. It's definitely easier to read when you get much more complex ones, but you could do it all in a single line, just like anything else in MySQL. So here's an actual example using our cats table. So we're just working with name and age, create table cats. One thing I should point out is that table names should be pluralized. So it doesn't actually matter for the mechanics or behind the scenes, it won't change anything, but you want to just follow this convention. Use plural, because that's what a table describes, is multiple cats, or people instead of person, or payments instead of payment, and so on. Okay, so we have parentheses, and then we list our columns and their corresponding data types. So name will be a varchar with a 100 character limit, comma, age will be an integer. So let's hop over to Cloud9 and see if it works. So the first thing I'll do is just make a new database. You don't have to do this if you're following along, but I'll just call one cat app. Oops, forgot my semicolon. Then we will use, okay. So now the next thing we'll do is create table cats. And then we can either do parentheses here, and that's what I usually do when I'm working in the MySQL command line, or in the shell, so you don't have to worry about spaces too much. So create table cats, and then we'll say name is varchar 100, comma, age is an int, and then we'll close our parenthesis with a semicolon. Query OK, 0 rows affected. Perfect. It appears to have worked, or at least we have to trust that it worked, because right now we don't have a way of testing that, but we will in the next video. Cliffhanger. So we left off by creating a new cats table, and it said query OK, but the question is, how do we know that it worked? How do we know that it did what we wanted it to do? So there's a couple of options. The first command I'll show you is pretty straightforward, show tables. Very similar to show databases, it just is going to show you the current tables in your database. So we can try that now in Cloud9. We'll do show tables, just like that. And it tells us tables in cat app, there's one called cats. So that's great. It tells us that there is a cats table, but that's pretty much it. It doesn't say anything about the contents of that table. What are the different columns in it? Which brings us to our next command, which is, again, using show columns from a table name. So in this case, we would say show columns from cats. So let's try it out now. And as you can see, we get some nice little table back here that says we've got two fields, name and age. Name is a varchar with 100 limit, and age is an integer. And don't worry about this 11 for now. Then we've got some other data that we're also not going to worry about, because we're going to talk quite a bit about it in the next section. But there are some other categories here that we're just going to ignore. But this is what we want. Name, varchar, age, int. Perfect. One other thing I'll show you is that you can use a shorter version. Technically, these are slightly different commands, but used in this context, there is no difference. So we can use describe, or DESC, a table name, and that's my preference. It's shorter, easier to remember. So let's try that out. Describe cats. You can see we get the exact same printout. So I did say that you could use them differently in a more advanced setting where you can basically pass in some other things to describe. So anyways, it doesn't really matter, but I just want you to know they're not exactly identical. It's not like one is a shortcut for the other, but they do the same thing in this context. All right, so this video was pretty quick. It was just about kind of testing and making sure that when you create a table, it's created accurately and that you can, one, tell that the table is there using show tables, but more importantly, see the actual columns in that table using these two commands. Okay, so the last little bit of syntax we'll learn in this section has to do with deleting tables. We've seen how to create tables. We've seen how to describe or show their columns. We haven't seen how to put anything in those tables yet. That's coming up next in the next section. But the last thing we'll do is see how we delete them. So think to yourself for a moment, what's your guess about how you delete a table? My hint is that it's pretty similar to how we've seen how to delete something else before in MySQL. Okay, so think about that, and I'll just wait here for a second, I guess. Maybe make a coffee. All right, so the magic is drop table and then the table name. So rather than drop database, we're going to say drop table and then cats in our case. So just to prove to you that that works, let's give it a shot. Back in Cloud9, I will type drop table cats. And this is permanent, it's going to disappear. It tells us query OK. To make sure that it's actually gone, we could use a couple of different things. It's up to you. We can do show tables. Oops. And it tells us empty set, there are no tables here. Whereas before when we did that, we got data. And if we try to describe cats now, we get an error because cats no longer exists. So it can't even show us the columns because it doesn't exist. So that's all there is to dropping or deleting a table. Very similar to dropping a database. So to close out this section here, we're going to get a little practice with data types and the syntax for creating and deleting tables. So one more activity. This time, I'd like you to imagine that you work at a pastry shop. So you're going to manage, and I manage in air quotes that you can't see me doing right now, but you're going to manage a pastry shop in the inventory for these pastries. It's going to be very simplistic, but you'll need to create a pastries table. And there should be at least 2 columns. If you want to add more, that's fine. But a name for the pastry, so what is it, a croissant, a chocolate donut, whatever it is, as well as a quantity, which should be a number. So I could go in and see that there are 10 croissants or 5 chocolate croissants and so on. But we won't fill it with data because we haven't seen how to do that. So we're just defining the table and the columns. So I'd like you to do that. Then use a command to inspect your table and the columns using the MySQL command line interface. So one of those short little commands we saw, just to make sure, basically to check your work. And then lastly, delete all that hard work, delete your table. So pause the video if you'd like, go through this and come back when you're done. And I'll be here. Okay, so I'm back in Cloud9. I'm actually still, if I select database, I'm still using cat app. There are no tables in it right now because I deleted the cats table, but I'm just going to put our pastries table in here, even though it has nothing to do with cat app. Maybe it's a cat bakery or something. I've seen dog bakeries, so maybe we're not too far off. But anyways, it's just a silly exercise. So we want to create a table. So create table, and then the name of the table will be pastries, plural. Then in parentheses, and I'm going to do it on one line just to show you that it's not a problem. So we'll have the name of the pastry. And one thing that you may be tempted to do if you come from some other databases is to put a colon there. That's something I find myself doing, just from experience that I have with some other tools. But you don't want that there. So if you see me doing that, hopefully I catch myself. Create table pastries. Name is going to be a varchar. And it should be 50 characters maximum. So in parentheses, 50. And then we have age, we have quantity. And if you wanted to abbreviate that with just QTY, which is what you'll see pretty commonly, you could do that as well. And that's just an integer. Then we need our semicolon to end it. We hit enter, and we have a nice little error message. So that was accidental. I'm not going to try and play it off like I did it on purpose. But I am going to leave it in here. And that's mainly because it's something that pops up pretty commonly. People aren't perfect, at least I'm not, especially when I'm recording. Got a lot of stuff to worry about. Can you identify what went wrong. I'll give you a hint, I'm just missing one character. Yep, if you got it, I'm missing a comma here. And the error messages aren't always that useful, but it tells me there's an error in my syntax. And it's something near quantity int. So right before that, I'm missing a comma. And it's treating all of this as name, which is wrong. We need that comma there. So we can recall the line, go back, and insert our comma. Now when we do it, we get query OK, and we'll move on to the next part, which was to make sure things worked. So we could either do show tables, and then we can do show, let's do describe pastries. Perfect. Name, varchar, quantity is an int. And the last thing was to drop our pastries table. Drop table pastries. Goodbye pastries. And just to verify it worked, let's do show tables again, and there's nothing here. Perfect. So the next section is all going to be about inserting data. We make tables, they're empty. How do we get stuff in there?